The rope bit into her wrists, a fact she had stopped noticing hours ago. It was just another part of her, like the sun beating on her skull or the dust that had worked its way into a second skin. It coated her tongue, filled her nose, and turned the frayed hem of her dress the color of the earth she was bound to. She was tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square, a raw clearing between false-fronted buildings that leaned on each other for support. Her gaze was fixed on a loose board on the saloon porch across the way. She studied its grain, the way the sun had bleached it to the color of bone, the single dark knot that stared back like an unblinking eye. It was better than looking at the faces. The faces swam at the edges of her vision, curious, contemptuous, or worse, utterly bored. They were a murmuring beast, their words indistinct but the tone as sharp as kicked gravel. A man named Sterling had put her here. He had a voice that boomed with the hollow confidence of a cheap drum, and he liked the sound of it. He was circling her now, extolling her virtues as if she were a broodmare. He pointed out the straightness of her back, the supposed strength in her frame, though she was thin as a fence rail and swayed with a weariness that went bone deep. She had been passed from one man to another for a week, a piece of living currency to settle a string of sour card games, and Sterling was the last in the line. He wanted cash. She had learned not to have a name. A name was a handle, something for them to grip. So she had shed it, let it fall away somewhere back on the trail, and became only a shape, a presence to be endured. She learned to make her face a blank canvas, to let her eyes go glassy and distant. It was a kind of armor, this emptiness. It was all she had left. The dust lifted in the street as a man on a tired-looking gelding rode into the square. He did not join the small clutch of onlookers but stopped near the water trough, dismounting with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that spoke of old aches. He wore a coat the color of the trail, faded and softened by 1,000 suns and 100 rains. He moved to the trough, pumping the handle until water spilled into the stone basin, and let his horse drink. He did not look at her. Not at first. He leaned against the trough, his hat tipped low, and the shadow it cast hid his eyes. But she felt his attention, a quiet weight in the shimmering heat. It was different from the others. It was not a prying or a judging. It was a stillness. A simple, heavy noticing. Section he saw the way her shoulders were held, a rigid line against the slump of her body. He saw the cracked skin of her bare feet, the dark crescents of dirt beneath her fingernails. He saw the blankness in her eyes and knew, in the way a man who has known great loss knows things, that it was not emptiness but a space filled with so much pain there was no room for anything else. Sterling's voice grated on the air. Guaranteed worker, this one. Quiet, too. Won't give a man no trouble. A man in the small crowd laughed, a wet, ugly sound. The man at the trough, Elias, pushed his hat back. His face was weathered, a landscape of sun and wind, and he carried whole winters in his eyes. He looked at Sterling, his expression unreadable. He had come to town for flour and salt, not for this. He had buried his life on a small hill behind his house 2 years ago, and his heart with it. He had no use for another person. His cabin was a shell, a place to sleep and eat, and he was the ghost that haunted it. And yet, he saw the hitching post. He saw the rope. He saw the dignity she clung to like a fraying thread, a thing so subtle most would not even see it was there. It was in the straightness of her spine, the way she refused to meet any gaze, staring instead at that wooden board as if it held all the world's secrets. Sterling was getting impatient. The novelty was wearing off for the onlookers. They were drifting away, back to the shade of the saloon or the mercantile. Last chance? Sterling boomed, gesturing to her with a sweep of his arm. Cheap price for a strong back. Elias straightened up from the trough. He walked forward, his boots stirring little puffs of dust that lifted behind them like ghosts. The sound was soft, but in the thinning crowd, it was loud enough. Sterling turned, an annoyance flickering in his eyes that shifted to a greasy sort of welcome when he saw Elias approach. Elias stopped a few feet away. He didn't look at her, not directly. He looked at the rope on her wrists. He looked at Sterling. How much? His voice was low, rough, like it came from under floorboards. It had not been used much lately. Sterling's eyes lit with greed. He named a price that was absurd and insult. Elias didn't flinch. He reached into the pocket of his worn trousers and pulled out a small leather pouch. He didn't have what Sterling asked for. Not in coin. He looked at Sterling, a long, quiet look. That's about what you still owe me for those fence posts last spring, he said. His voice was flat. A statement of fact, not an accusation. Sterling's face soured. He remembered. He had hoped Elias had forgotten or wouldn't have the stomach to call the debt in front of people. That was a different matter. Was it? Elias let the question hang in the hot, still air. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was a hard, unyielding thing in his gaze that Sterling recognized. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and so could not be bluffed. A long silence stretched between them. The sun beat down. A fly buzzed lazily past her ear. Finally, Sterling spat on the ground. Fine. Take her. She's probably more trouble than she's worth anyway. He turned and stalked toward the saloon, his anger a stiff line in his back. The few remaining townsfolk watched, then shrugged and moved on. The show was over. Elias stood there for a moment. He was alone with her in the center of the empty square. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his coat. The blade clicked open. He stepped behind her, and she flinched, a small, involuntary tightening of her muscles. It was the first movement she had allowed herself in hours. He paused. He did not touch her. He simply reached forward, slipped the blade between the rough rope and the wood of the post, and sawed through the fibers. The tension gave way. He did the same for the ropes around her wrists. They fell away, leaving angry red welts on her skin. She did not move. Her arms remained in the air for a moment, as if they had forgotten how to fall. Slowly, she lowered them to her sides. She rubbed one wrist, a small, unconscious gesture. She still did not look at him. She looked at her feet, at the dust. He stepped back, giving her space. He folded his knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He gestured with his head toward his horse. Come on. It was not a command. It was a simple statement. She hesitated for a long second. She looked from his dusty boots up to his weathered face, finally meeting his eyes for the first time. They were gray, the color of a winter sky, and held no malice. Only a profound, bottomless exhaustion that she recognized as a mirror to her own. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He turned and walked toward his horse. He did not look back to see if she was following. He trusted that she would. And after a moment, her bare feet began to move, shuffling through the dust, following the quiet man away from the center of the town. The journey was a long stretch of silence broken only by the plodding of the horse's hooves and the sigh of the wind across the sparse, brittle grass. He walked, leading the gelding, and she walked beside him. He had offered for her to ride, but she had shaken her head, a small, definite movement. To be that high up felt exposed, a target. The ground under her feet was real, solid. The sun was a merciless hammer. After an hour, he stopped and unhooked a canteen from the saddle. He drank, then held it out to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, calloused. Hers was dry and chapped. She drank, the water tasting of metal and dust and life. She handed it back, her throat too raw for a word of thanks. He seemed to expect none. He just capped the canteen and they walked on. The land itself was holding its breath. It was a hard, unforgiving place of cracked earth and skeletal trees that clawed at the pale sky. It stretched on forever in every direction, offering no comfort, no place to hide. The wind turned mean as the afternoon wore on, plucking at her thin dress and whipping strands of hair across her face. They arrived at his home as dusk was bleeding blood orange and violet across the horizon. The cabin was small, built of hand-hewn logs chinked with mud that had cracked and crumbled in places. It sagged a little to one side as if tired of standing against the wind. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a sign he had left a fire banked. Beside the cabin stood a small, sturdy barn, and beyond that, a fenced-in corral. The whole place looked weathered, worn down to its essentials, just like the man himself. On a small, grassy rise a short distance from the house, there was a single mound of earth marked with a simple wooden cross. She saw it, and something in the set of his shoulders as he glanced toward it told her everything she needed to know. This was a place of deep and abiding grief. He led the horse to the barn, unsaddled it, and rubbed it down with a practiced efficiency. She stood in the yard, wrapping her arms around herself, a sudden chill crawling over her skin despite the day's heat. The silence out here was different from the silence of the town. It was bigger, emptier. It was a living thing. When he came out of the barn, he didn't go to the house. He went to the woodpile and began to split logs for the night, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing in the vast quiet. He seemed to be giving her time, letting her acclimate to the space on her own terms. She watched him for a while, the clean, powerful swing of the axe, the way his body moved with a familiar grace born of endless repetition. Then her gaze drifted to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. Hesitantly, she walked toward it, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. She pushed it open. The inside was one room. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire pulsing like a sleepy heart within it. There was a rough sawn table with 2 chairs, a bed tucked into a corner with a patchwork quilt, and a small area sectioned off with a hanging blanket that served as a pantry. It was sparse, clean, and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, something like loneliness. He came in behind her, his arms loaded with firewood, which he stacked neatly by the hearth. He moved to the fire, stoked it, and added a fresh log. Flames licked up, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The room seemed to breathe again, to wake up. He gestured to a small cot on the opposite side of the room from his own bed. It was little more than a frame with a thin mattress, but a clean, folded blanket lay on top of it. "That's yours," he said. He then moved to the makeshift pantry, took out a heel of bread, a piece of cheese, and filled a tin cup with water from a bucket. He set them on the table on the side closer to her. He didn't invite her to eat. He just put the food there, an offering. Then he went and sat in the chair by the fire, his back to her, and began mending a piece of tack, his hands busy and sure. She understood the unspoken contract. He was offering shelter, food, a safe place to sleep. He was not demanding conversation or gratitude or anything else. He was respecting her space, her silence. The door was not locked. The cot was as far from his bed as the small room allowed. He was a wall between her and the world, but not a cage. She crept to the table and sat down. Her hands trembled as she picked up the bread. It was stale, but it was the first food she had not had to snatch or fight for in a long time. She ate slowly, deliberately, making it last. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the soft scrape of his knife on the leather, and the sound of her own quiet chewing. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a sliver of something that was not fear. It was not hope, not yet. It was just a pause. A quiet, safe pause. Days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar but by the rising and setting of a relentless sun. A routine began to form between them, an unspoken choreography of shared existence. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her, and go out to tend to the horse and the small clutch of chickens he kept. She would wake to the smell of wood smoke and, later, coffee. At first, she stayed inside, watching him through the single grimy window as he moved about the yard. He chopped wood, mended the sagging fence line that bordered his property, worked the hard soil of a small garden patch. He moved with a steady, tireless rhythm, as if the work itself was the only thing holding him together. After a few days of this, a quiet shame began to prick at her. She was eating his food, sleeping under his roof. She crept out of the cabin one morning while he was at the far end of the property. She found the broom, a bundle of bound twigs, and swept the packed earth floor of the cabin until it was clean. She took the tin plates and cups to the rain barrel and scrubbed them with sand until they shone. When he came back in for his midday meal of bread and jerky, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at the clean floor, the neat stack of plates. His gaze met hers for a brief second. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, and that was all. But it was enough. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. She grew bolder in her silent contributions. She started pulling weeds in the garden, her fingers finding a strange comfort in the damp earth. She learned the chickens' habits, gathering the few precious eggs each day and placing them in a bowl on the table. She found his mending basket, full of worn shirts and socks, and began to stitch them with small, neat stitches, her hands remembering a skill from a life before this one. He, in turn, began to leave things for her. One cool morning, a heavy wool shawl appeared on the end of her cot. It was old and smelled of cedar, but it was warm. When he saw her struggling to draw water with the heavy bucket, he spent an afternoon rigging a pulley system that made the job easier. He never said, "I did this for you," he just did it, and the action spoke louder than words ever could. One afternoon, she walked to the small grave on the hill. The wooden cross was weathered, the name carved into it, Mary, faded by the sun. A few stubborn wildflowers grew near the base. She knelt and pulled the weeds from around them, tidying the small plot of land. She stayed there for a long time, her hand resting on the dry earth, feeling the deep well of sorrow that radiated from it. When she came back to the cabin, he was standing on the porch, watching her. He didn't speak, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to have eased, just a little. He had let her into his grief, and she had tended to it. Their silences began to change. At first, they had been heavy, full of suspicion and sorrow. Now they were companionable, a shared space where words were not necessary. They would sit by the fire at night, he carving a piece of wood into some small, useful object, she mending a tear in a blanket. The air was thick with things unsaid, but it was not an uncomfortable thickness. It was the quiet of two people slowly, cautiously learning the shape of each other's solitude. One day, she decided to bake bread. She had watched him make his own dense, serviceable loaves. She found the flour and yeast and tried to replicate it. The result was a small, hard lump of cooked dough that was nearly impossible to cut. She was staring at it in dismay when he came in. He looked at the sad, rock-like loaf on the table. He picked it up, tested its weight in his hand, and set it down with a soft thud. He looked at her, and the corner of his mouth twitched, the first hint of a smile she had ever seen on his face. "That loaf died in vain," he said, his voice laced with a dry, rusty sort of humor. A blush crept up her neck. "It's a little dry. You didn't complain about mine," he countered, his gray eyes watching her. And then, a sound she hadn't heard from her own throat in years. A small, choked laugh. It was a strange, foreign thing, but it was real. He heard it, and the small twitch at his mouth softened into something warmer. He took the knife and sawed off a piece of the disastrous bread, and ate it. He chewed for a very long time. That night, the past came for her. It came in the form of a dream, full of shouting voices and rough hands and the suffocating darkness of a wagon bed. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright on her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting the room in a deep red gloom. She heard a rustle from the other side of the room. He was sitting up on his own bed, a silhouette against the dying light. He didn't speak for a long moment. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. "You hurt?" he asked finally, his voice a low rumble. She couldn't answer. She just shook her head, a jerky, frantic movement. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller. He got up, not from his bed, but from his chair by the fire. He added a small log to the embers, coaxing them back to life. He didn't come near her. He just sat in his chair, a silent, steady sentinel, and waited with her for the dawn to come and chase the shadows away. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He offered his presence, a quiet anchor in the terrifying darkness. As the first gray light began to filter through the window, he spoke again, his voice soft. "What do they call you?" She thought of the string of names she had been called, none of them her own. She thought of the name she had buried. She shook her head. To have a name was to be known, and to be known was to be vulnerable. He didn't press her. He just nodded, accepting her silence as her answer. But the question lingered in the air between them. He had asked who she was, not what she was. And in the quiet safety of his cabin, she began, for the first time, to wonder about the answer herself. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The first sign of trouble was a plume of dust on the far horizon, too deliberate for a dust devil, too steady for a stray animal. Elias saw it from the fence line he was mending. He stopped his work, his hand tightening on the post maul. He watched the dust cloud grow, resolving itself into the shape of two riders moving at a confident pace. He knew with a sinking certainty in his gut who it was. The world he had built, this fragile sanctuary of silence and routine, was about to be broken. He walked back to the cabin, his stride unhurried but purposeful. She was outside, hanging his mended shirts on a line strung between the cabin and a tree. She saw the riders too, and she froze, the clothespin falling from her slack fingers. The color drained from her face, leaving it ashen. All the tentative peace they had cultivated over the weeks vanished, replaced by the old, familiar specter of fear. It clung to her like wet paper. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and even. It was the first direct order he had ever given her. She looked at him, her eyes wide and pleading. He just nodded toward the door. "Go on." She fled into the cabin, shutting the door behind her, but he knew she would be at the window watching. Elias did not go inside. He stood in the middle of the yard, his feet planted firmly on the ground he considered his own. He was not a fighter by nature, not anymore. The fight had been drained out of him on the day he dug his wife's grave. But there were some things a man had to stand for. He just wasn't sure until this very moment that he had anything left to stand for. The riders came to a stop just outside his fence. It was Sterling, just as he'd known it would be, and another man, a hired gun with cold, empty eyes. Sterling sat atop his fine horse with an air of smug ownership, a stark contrast to Elias's worn and weathered appearance. "Elias," Sterling called out, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "Good to see you're still breathing out here in all this nothing." Elias didn't answer. He just waited, his silence a more potent reply than any words. Sterling's smile tightened. He swung down from his horse, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He sauntered to the fence, resting his arms on the top rail as if he were discussing the weather. "I've come for my property. The debt is settled. I'll be taking the girl back now." "She's not property," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the yard with absolute clarity. Sterling laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Don't be a fool. I paid for her, you settled a debt with her. She belongs to me. That's the law of it." He gestured to the cabin. "Send her out." "No." The single word dropped into the tense air like a stone. Sterling's face darkened, the flimsy mask of civility falling away. "Don't make this difficult, old man. I have a buyer waiting in Willow Creek. A man who appreciates fine things. I'm not leaving without her." "You're not setting foot on this land," Elias stated. "And you're not taking her." He hadn't moved. His hands were loose at his sides. He was not a physically imposing man, but there was an immovable quality to him, like a great, weathered rock that had stood against the wind for 1,000 years. He was protecting more than a person, he was protecting a fledgling flicker of life, in her and in himself. "Is that so?" Sterling sneered. He nodded to the man with him who dismounted slowly, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. "I think we are. You're one man. An old one at that." The cabin door creaked open. She stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the dark interior. Her face was pale, but her chin was lifted. The fear was still there, a tremor in her hands, but it was joined by something else now. A hard, cold anger. She had swept this floor. She had mended the clothes of the man who stood in the yard. She had placed flowers on his wife's grave. This was her place. They would not take it from her. She stepped out onto the porch, holding a short, heavy piece of firewood in one hand. She held it like a club, her knuckles white. Sterling saw her and a predatory grin spread across his face. "There she is. See? She's eager to come with me." He started to move toward the gate in the fence. "I said no," Elias repeated, and this time he took a step forward, placing himself directly between Sterling and the cabin. Directly between Sterling and her. And then she spoke. Her voice was thin and rough from disuse, but it was sharp, cutting through Sterling's arrogance. "He's right," she said. Sterling stopped, startled. He stared at her as if she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly spoken. She took another step, coming to stand just behind Elias's shoulder. She did not touch him, but her presence was a palpable force, a declaration. "I am not your property," she said, the words gaining strength as she spoke them. "I am not a thing." Sterling was momentarily stunned, then his face twisted in rage. To be defied by the man was an insult. To be defied by her was an impossibility. It broke his understanding of the world. "You insolent. I'll teach you your place." He lunged for the gate, but Elias was faster. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply moved to block the way, his body a solid, unyielding barrier. The hired gun took a step forward, his hand now fully on his pistol. "Don't," Elias warned, his eyes locked on the man. It was a standoff. The sun beat down. The wind whispered through the dry grass, the only sound in a world gone silent. The hired gun looked from Elias's unblinking gaze to the woman on the porch with the piece of wood to his employer's sputtering rage. He was being paid, but maybe not enough for this. There was a kind of madness in defiance, this quiet, this absolute. It was unnerving. Sterling, seeing the hesitation in his man, seemed to deflate. His rage had no purchase here. It slid off Elias's calm and her newfound defiance like water off oilskin. He was a bully, and his power came from the fear of his victims. These two were not afraid. Not in the way that mattered. He spat on the ground, the same gesture of contempt he had used in town. But here, in the vast emptiness of Elias's land, it seemed small, pathetic. "Keep her," he snarled, his voice stripped of its boom. "She'll bring you nothing but trouble." He turned, climbed back on his horse, and without another word, he and his man rode away, their departure stirring up the same dust as their arrival. They stood there, Elias in the yard and she on the porch, and watched until the dust was just a memory on the horizon. The silence that descended was profound. The threat was gone. The land was theirs again. He finally turned and looked at her. He saw the firewood still clutched in her hand, the fierce, protective light in her eyes. He walked to the porch and stopped in front of her. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the piece of wood from her hand. His fingers brushed hers. He looked down at the wood, then back at her face. "You didn't run," he said, his voice quiet with a kind of wonder. "No," she whispered. "I didn't." He nodded slowly. A deep, unspoken understanding passed between them in that look. It was a promise given and received. A line had been drawn in the dust, and they had stood on the same side of it. Together. He turned and carried the firewood inside, and after a moment she followed him into the quiet safety of their home. The confrontation left a strange quiet in its wake, a space cleared of old fears. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them was different again. It was no longer just comfortable, it was intimate. The shared danger had forged something new between them, something stronger than the unspoken routines and small kindnesses. They had stitched their lives together with raw thread, and now that thread had been tested and held. He was looking at her, a long, thoughtful gaze. The firelight played across her face, softening the hard lines of weariness and fear, revealing a strength she was only just beginning to recognize in herself. He had seen her as a person from the very beginning, when she was no more than a piece of chattel tied to a post. But he did not know her. "Lena," he said, his voice soft. The name hung in the air. It was a simple, clean sound. It had no history, no ghosts attached to it. It was new. She looked up at him, her heart giving a strange, slow lurch. It was not a question. It was a gift. He was not asking her name, he was giving her one. An identity separate from the nameless girl at the auction, separate from the woman she used to be. A chance to begin again. A tear, hot and surprising, slid down her cheek. It was the first she had shed in his presence. She did not wipe it away. She let it trace a clean path through the grime of the past. "Lena," she repeated, her voice a bare whisper. She tried the name on her own tongue, and it fit. It felt like her own. She looked at him, and for the first time she offered him a true, unshadowed smile. It was a small, fragile thing, but it transformed her face. It reached her eyes. He watched that smile, and something deep inside his chest, a place that had been frozen solid for 2 years, began to thaw. He had saved her, perhaps. But in saving her, he realized, saving himself. The next morning, she woke with a sense of purpose. While he was out with the horse, she took the ragged, filthy dress she had been wearing when she arrived. It was a symbol of everything she had endured, a shroud of her former life. She held it for a moment, then walked to the hearth where the morning fire was burning bright. Without ceremony, without hesitation, she pushed it into the flames. The fabric caught, blackened, and curled into ash. She watched it burn until nothing was left but a wisp of smoke rising up the chimney. She felt lighter. She put on one of his old, patched shirts, which hung on her like a tent, and rolled up the sleeves. It smelled of him, of wood smoke and clean sweat and earth. It smelled like safety. When he came back in and saw her standing there in his shirt, her face clear and calm in the morning light, he simply nodded. He understood. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And something new was. Life settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by survival but by living. Her humming, at first a quiet, subconscious sound as she worked in the garden, grew more confident. Laughter, once a choked and foreign sound, became easier, sparked by a clumsy chicken or one of his rare, dry jokes. He started talking more, telling her small things about the land, about the way the light changed in the autumn, about the wife he had loved and lost. He spoke of his grief not as a wound, but as a scar, something that was a part of him but no longer defined him completely. He taught her to read using the worn pages of an old Bible, the only book he owned. Her finger would trace the words as he spoke them. His low voice a steady presence beside her. She, in turn, showed him how to find the best wild herbs, how to make a poultice that eased the ache in his shoulder. They were building a life, not with grand gestures, but with the accumulation of 1,000 small, shared moments. The house, which had been a hollow, haunted shell, began to feel like a home. It breathed with them. One evening they sat on the small porch watching the sunset. It was a ritual they had developed, a quiet time to mark the end of the day. The sky was a riot of color, painting the harsh landscape in shades of soft pink and deep purple. He was whittling a piece of wood and she was mending a blanket, her stitches now even and sure. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met," she said softly, not looking at him, "or the most foolish." He stopped his whittling. He looked out at the horizon, a faint smile on his lips. "Can't I be both?" She looked at him then, at his weathered profile against the twilight sky. The winters in his eyes had receded, replaced by a quiet warmth. The love she felt for him was not a sudden fire, but a slow-growing, deep-rooted thing, as sturdy and resilient as the few hardy trees that survived on this land. He put down his knife and the piece of wood. He reached over and took her hand. His callous fingers wrapped around hers. It was not a gesture of ownership or even of passion. It was a gesture of simple, profound connection. A promise. He would never let her hand slip away. They sat there in the deepening twilight, hand in hand, watching the first stars appear in the vast, dark sky. The wind whispered around the corners of the cabin, but inside, a lamp cast a warm, steady glow. They had found each other in the dust and degradation of a forgotten town, two broken souls who, in their shared silence and quiet care, had managed to piece each other back together. The land was still hard, the winters would still be long, but they would face them together. And that, they both knew, was more than enough. This story, it isn't just about rescue. It's not about a strong man saving a damsel. Anyone can cut a rope. The real story, the one that matters, happens in the quiet moments after. It's in the offering of a cup of water without asking for thanks. It's in the sweeping of a floor that isn't yours. It is a story about the slow, patient work of earning trust when all you've ever known is betrayal. It's about how two people, hollowed out by their own private griefs, can find a way to fill the empty spaces in each other. He gave her safety, and she, in turn, gave him a reason to live beyond mere survival. She tended to the grave of his past, and he gave her a name for her future. They didn't heal each other with grand words or passionate declarations. They did it with bread and mended shirts, with shared silence by a warm fire, with the simple, profound act of standing together when the world came to tear them apart. There's a naming in all our lives if we're lucky. A moment when someone sees past the dirt and the ropes and gives us a name that isn't about what we've been, but about who we could be. And there's a choice, always a choice, to pick up a piece of firewood and stand your ground, to declare that you are not a thing to be bought or sold. So if you ever find yourself on a piece of hard, unforgiving land with nothing but the wind for company, don't just look for a shelter from the storm. Look for the person who will sit with you in the dark until the morning comes. If you're brave enough, you might just find that the most desolate places can become home, not because the land gets any softer, but because you are no longer standing on it alone.